Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I am staff writer Cody Goodwin, joined again here with Alex Scarborough and Mike Rodak. Fall camp for Alabama opens this week. Guys, we have made it. How do we feel about the fact that we have finally gotten through this long slog of an off season?
Relieved and anxious at the same time. It'll be nice to not talk about the same 15 things we've talked about before, but also not ready for the season and knowing everything that comes along with it. But so a mixture of both.
Mike, how you feeling?
Yeah, I mean, we get to this is our last time talking about old stuff, if you will, because everything we generally do is based on the spring, because that's the last time we're able to see this team. And finally, beginning Wednesday, we'll be able to see them again, and there's hopefully some new wrinkles and threads that will come out of that. So once more around for the off season here.
Same reason. I'm excited to finally watch some ball. I'm excited to hopefully, fingers crossed, watch some practices. Like maybe we can see some of these workouts and like really kind of ask some more in-depth questions about some of the things that we see. We'll find all of that out on Wednesday. That's when Alabama officially opens their fall camp. We'll hopefully have more of an in-depth schedule, and that may alter our podcast schedule as we go through the next month or so. Week one still 30-some days away, but we're getting closer. We're getting closer, and I know fall camp is an exciting time for everybody, especially those who are listening. Today, to kind of preview fall camp, figured we could play – I keep saying play games, but like we're going to have a discussion about Alabama's roster. We each picked a position or position group or a position battle that we're maybe super interested in monitoring or following or covering throughout fall camp. And then we also each picked a player that we are excited, intrigued by, curious about when it comes to Alabama's roster and what it means for the 2024 season. So 6 total discussion points here. We each picked a position. We each picked a player, and we're just going to kind of hash it out, see how we feel ahead of fall camp opening on Wednesday and just kind of what it means for Alabama's, kind of greater outlook for the 2024 season. So Alex, I'll start with you. We'll go with the position battles or position groups first. What position group or position battle are you most intrigued to watch or follow during fall camp?
I went with the offensive line. I feel like I get a little bit of everything there. I get to follow Caden Proctor. I get to see what's going on with Parker Brailsford after coming back from a weird spring, not being around and then not being around for the majority of it. A new player in Geno Vandemark, and a position battle at right tackle. Is it going to be Elijah Pritchett, who's a former 5-star, got a lot of upside? We haven't seen it quite yet. There's a lot of optimism there. Or can a Wilkin Formby, a local kid who had a strong spring, has had a lot of positive talk this offseason, can he play a role in there? Don't forget Miles McVay. So you get a little bit of everything there and then you have returning Booker and Jaden Roberts, maybe two of the best guard combo in the SEC. And we've talked about those players a lot, but the other part to me that makes it really intriguing is the position coaching change. Is Coach Cat being there? What is the philosophical difference going to look like from the last few years? We've noticed with players like Tyler Brooker, from talking to Caden Proctor, slimming down a little bit. I think the last few years they looked a little bit of a step slow in terms of getting big. So how does that play out on the football field? I think the schematic piece of things, the position groups, and then the personalities that are there are really going to be interesting to follow. And knowing that, look, it's cliche, but it's true. If they're not winning up front, they're not going to win on offense.
No, I think that's a really good point and a really good position group to start with because of how integral it is to DeBoer's offense and what they want to do, right? Lots of screen passes, lots of pulling from the offensive linemen. Like he is going to get those guys. He asked those guys to move a lot in space, to block in space, to open up holes and running lanes and this, that, and the next for the offensive skill guys, right? A lot of his offense is not dissimilar from Steve Sarkisian's offense, where we're going to get the playmaker the ball in space, we're going to let him go to work. But a lot of that also comes down to the offensive line, ensuring that these guys have the space and the necessary, holes to hit. And that's really, really important. And so the scheme aspect part of that, I think, is super intriguing because, a lot was made last year of Alabama's offensive line being the big bad bullies on the block. They really didn't live up to that billing. But I remember the very first game of the season, SEC Network had that graphic where here's the average size of Alabama's offensive line compared to the biggest offensive line in the NFL. Holy cow, these guys are huge. You know, it obviously didn't work out that way, or at least it didn't work out fairly well over the course of the season. But yeah, seeing how these guys develop in terms of what's being asked of them now in this new offense, I think is one of the most intriguing parts of fall camp.
Yeah, I remember that graphic and thinking in real time, is this a good thing or is this a undetermined thing? And then it looked during the course of the season that it was not a good thing. And it's weird. The last few years, it's felt like Alabama has across the starting five been able to win one-on-one battles because they're physically so gifted, but they weren't a collective unit. They weren't as good as the sum of their parts. And I wonder if the scheme and what you're talking about can sort of remedy a little bit of that. Maybe that's optimistic thinking, but I do just think they've underperformed for a few years now. And I think with the pieces they have coming back and a fresh outlook from Cap and from on up with DeBoer, who also has experience coaching the offensive line, I think they're in for a nice change.
Looking at the offensive line, at least the way that we understand it now, from left to right, I think we're all under the presumption that Caden Proctor is going to slide back in at left tackle. Tyler Booker, left guard, Parker Brailsford at center, Jaden Roberts at right guard, and then position battle, obviously, there at right tackle between some combination of Elijah Pritchett, Wilkin Formby, Miles McVay. You know, Vandenbark, you mentioned, a guy who's probably that swing interior guy. Also got a handful of other younger guys who didn't get a ton of playing time. We saw a little bit of them in the spring, but, you know, there is some depth there. There are some names to know, if maybe not with full of experience. Mike, when you look at Alabama's offensive line, what interests you the most about this position group entering fall camp?
The cadence, the things that people haven't forgotten about from last year. Like, look, the very last play of last season, you know, the low snap, just kind of the overall operation. You know, that I think to a lot of fans stuck out last year, not just the snap issues with Seth McLaughlin, but you go to Texas A&M, you have, I think it was 9 false start penalties. Just things weren't on the same page all the time. And now you have a new offensive system, B, a new center, C, you have a new headset system, and D, you have some new players around. You know, Proctor's back, Booker's back, Roberts is back. Maybe Formby is going to be a new starter at right tackle instead of J.C. Latham. So there's a lot of element, and you have the rest of the offense, which also has players that need to be in the right spot and go on the right the clap cadence that DeBoer is going to do. Everything has to just work operationally before you can even get to the schematic of Kalen DeBoer's play call. You just need to get the ball to the quarterback, get everybody on the same page. So just doing that, I think, is the first checkpoint. And how that all works in your 2 preseason games, if you will, against Western Kentucky and South Florida, and then going on the road, most importantly, to Wisconsin. How does that all work when there's crowd noise and inebriated Wisconsinites now that they can drink at Camp Randall? They just passed that last week. Right. Well, it's like NIL. Now that they can do it out in the open and legally, you know, school sponsored drinking at Wisconsin for big noon kickoff.
Waiting to happen.
Yeah, school sponsored drinking.
That game is going to be, I think, a big checkpoint for this offensive line. And yeah, there are road games, you know, after that, like Vandy, I don't think you have to worry about too much. Not really until you get to Tennessee. So that Wisconsin game kind of stands alone early in the season as the big one for the whole operation to work and to work smoothly.
That's a really good point on the procedural stuff, because I feel like I've said it a million times. Being in those 2nd and long, 3rd and long situations have just killed them the last 2 years. So whether it's procedural stuff, snap stuff, or not an inability to run the football on first down, if they can just get net positive on first down, that'll put them in a much better situation overall.
Another point that I wanted to get to about the offensive line, the whole Caden Proctor of the thing. I think there's a lot of intrigue, and maybe for me specifically, where is this dude at? Obviously did the whole transfer back and forth dance, leaving for Iowa for 5 minutes and then coming back, but he was not here for spring ball. So he missed on some very valuable reps. I just don't know where he's at physically, mentally. We haven't really, you know, I know Alex, you did that story about him, you know, coming back and the decision that went into it, but just in terms of his actual on the field play, I am very curious to see where he's at. How much work does he need to put in this fall camp in order to kind of get back up to speed with the rest of the unit, because he missed out on all those valuable reps. And I know they've been doing various workouts and whatnot over the summer, but it's kind of hard to replicate, the structure of, those spring practices. It's going to be, I wonder how much of a challenge it will be for him to get back, because, he was obviously a hot button topic last year with all of his struggles as a true freshman at left tackle. And we've also been very outspoken about, yes, he struggled, but also the second half of the season, he looked very good. Like, he evolved into, I think, the left tackle that Alabama needed in order to get as far as they did. He was hurt when he was playing in the Rose Bowl, obviously, so that maybe changed the calculus on that a little bit. But, is he going to come back in at the level where he was at later last season, or how much work is he going to have to do to get back to that point to be ready by week 1? I'm just very curious about where this dude is at coming into fall camp.
These are all fair questions. I mean, he would tell you he believes he found it late last season, and not just that, still has room for improvement on top of it. The physicality piece of it, I think, is going to be TBD. We're going to walk out there whenever we get to see practice, and we're going to look at it, the offensive line, and there's going to be no mistaking which one is Caden Proctor. He's going to be the best looking one out there. He looks like an NFL draft pick. He's physically, like, weight, distribution, strength, all of those things are right, but it is, did you take the hits like during the spring? Are you game ready? The good news is he's got all camp to do that. But yeah, that remains to be seen. And yeah, mentally he's saying all the right things. And you would hope that going through what he went through is a learning experience. I don't know how you don't learn from it. I mean, he was under a microscope in college football, but there's going to be, that microscope's not going away, and there's going to be college game day signs, and there's going to be all these things that are going to follow him all year long, I'm sure. And it's going to be up to him to respond to that. I think the promising thing through all of this is twofold. One, the relationship with the coaching staff that seems to be really good, but more important than that, the relationship with the players, the true friendships that are there, whether you're talking about a Wilkin Formby, a Tyler Booker, whoever it might be. He's got support there. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why he came back, period. So I think that will help him a lot. But again, it's TBD until we see it, because his freshman year was so up and down, and he had one of the most turbulent off seasons we can really remember.
I think that mental part of it, certainly it's big. Like, I think it's one of those things where, I think we have to be respectful when we're talking about it, because obviously we're talking about mental health concerns in general, for 19, 20-year-olds. Like, it's not something we should necessarily take lightly, but at the same time, like, there's some volatility there with Caden Proctor and Parker Brailsford based on what happened in the spring for both of them for different reasons. But it's fair, I think, to have some level of doubt or question there just about the demands of a SEC season. And if things don't go well for either of them, or if they don't go well for the team, how do those players respond? I think is a fair question to ask. And it's just something where we don't know. We don't know until it happens. But, I think Nick Saban made the point at media days when he was on TV talking about players these days in his mind are more affected by everybody else's external thoughts than they ever have been before. And I think the ability for some of those players to stay off social media and to kind of ignore some of that outside stuff is probably going to be important if things don't go well. And heck, even if things do go well, I think not drinking the Kool-Aid necessarily is also a good thing for their psyche, to kind of avoid the ups and downs. So, it's a fair question. I think I was just going back and looking, I talked to James Brockemeyer, who was the center in the spring, and he said, when I asked him about kind of the center situation, so all you can do is control what you can control. That's kind of the mindset that I have. Every day you make a decision, go to work, and I go to work. And I don't think that was meant as a slight at Parker Brailsford, but I think it still, from my perspective, applies, because they could rely on James Brockemeyer every single day of spring practice. He was out there, he was practicing, he was doing what he needed to do. For different reasons, it just wasn't the case for Parker Brailsford. So does that crop up again in the fall? Does it crop up at Caden Proctor, the volatility where he went back and forth between schools in a matter of 4 months? Again, we're talking about younger people, college-age people. So it's still something that should be on the radar. Is kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a good messenger from Brockermeyer, who's now going to work in another zip code. But
Yes.
it really does underline. It does underline the volatility of all of this, and it's not. You're right. We can only work with the evidence we have when it comes to Parker Brailsford and Caden Proctor. Fair or unfair, they've shown us something that needs to be addressed. But it is true. It is also true across the spectrum of a roster that people are going to deal with these things, whether they're young or old. It's just where we're at. And I do agree with Nick. I think those issues have always been there, but I do think they're amplified now more than ever. And wading through that is going to be really interesting. And that's why, it's up to the coaching staff, I think, in large part, to keep those things in check. Again, to your point, good or bad. It doesn't have to necessarily be bad because it's a long season. You can't get too high or too low.
I imagine that those topics will be broached in some capacity during fall camp, whether it's in a discussion about the offensive line or not. And I'm kind of curious to see what Kalen DeBoer and even Chris Kapilovich, new offensive line coach, has to say about that, because that's, I'm sure that they have been dealing with it in various capacities. So I wonder if even, do we even have to ask that question directly for it to maybe come up? It'd be interesting to see what they say when it gets asked. And I imagine it'll get asked early. Mike, what position group are you most interested in following or monitoring when fall camp opens on Wednesday?
Bandit and Wolves, which a lot of Alabama fans still probably don't know what that means. I think both of those are new terms that people are going to have to get used to, just like they got used to Star in Nick Saban's defense, which is now Husky, by the way. So Bandit is kind of that 4-3 defensive end type of player. Really didn't exist within Nick Saban's defense. I think it's kind of a new position, if you will. Right now, Jamarian Latham is that guy that I would expect to be out there. And then the Wolf position is more of the stand-up edge player, which is Quandarius Robinson. I would expect to be the first guy out there on Wednesday. So for me, the big question is, I think you can go through the season with both of those guys as your starters, playing most of the playing time at those spots. The question for me is, how good are you going to be as a defense with that being the case? Because they've both been kind of role players to this point in their careers, and they're both now in their fifth year. I don't know how much untapped potential there is. I don't know how high their ceiling is. I don't think either one of them has, day one or day two NFL potential in the draft next year. I think these at best are probably day three guys, just based on kind of what they've done so far. And there's a pretty big sample size in both cases. So just how good can you be with Jamarian Latham rushing the passer, Quandarius Robinson rushing the passer, or do some of the younger players at both of those spots break in or break out, I guess I should say, for, they're starting in place of those guys at one point. Like, that's still a question for me. I don't think it's necessarily going to be answered or solved during fall camp. It's probably something that might need to play out over the course of the season, but it might be something that you start to get a sense of, in fall camp and with the scrimmages. And, the bandit position right now, it's 2 5-star kids that would have, I guess, the first crack at beating Jamarian Latham at some point. And that's LT Overton, who comes from A&M, relatively underwhelming career at A&M for 2 years, compared to, where he was as a recruit. I think he was trying to find the right position. They were trying to find the right position for him in that defense. He put on some weight, lost some weight, didn't really have the right fit. In fact, even since he's been at Alabama, I think he was supposed to play that Justin Eboigbe role if he had stayed within Saban's defense. And now he's having to shift again and get a little bit lighter and play that 270-pound bandit role. But still a very talented player, and one that I think will be the second guy up in camp. And then, third is Keon Keeley, who is hard to, maybe easy to forget about because he's didn't do anything last year. He didn't play, but he's a top 10 prospect. Like, he's one of the highest ranked prospects that has ever come through Alabama in terms of our rankings. So for him to have that potential and not play this year, where would that leave him after year two? So how far can he get this year? Can he push Overton? Can he push Latham for that playing time is a big question for Keeley. And has probably the highest ceiling of any of these outside edge players in terms of being a real bona fide, like first round NFL draft pick sort of pass rusher. Just haven't seen it yet. And then the Wolf position, it's kind of the same deal. You have Robinson, who's that solid fifth-year guy, and then behind him, Quay Rusa, Yanze Pierre, and then the freshman Noah Carter, and Keanu Cott. I mean, he's also a veteran. I think has a little bit higher ceiling than Quandarius Robinson, but those last three guys are still probably more in the category of untapped potential younger players, five-star kids in both Rusa and Pierre's case, and just how quickly do they come along is another question. And how does this all work in terms of if you put Quay Rusa out there as a five-star pass rusher and he's dropping back because he's playing the Wolf position in Kane Womack's defense, then a lot of people got mad at Pete Golding for doing that with Will Anderson and certain players. So I just wonder, like, what is this pass rush going to look like? Is there going to be two or three guys out there? Can you run like a cheetah package where you have Rusa and Overton and Latham, or some combination of all these guys? And at the end of the day, what are the numbers going to look like? Can you go out there and can these guys beat the tackles at LSU, which two very high draft picks coming in, Will Campbell and Emory Jones? Can you beat Georgia's offensive tackles? Can you beat Tennessee's offensive tackles? Like, all these are very high level players, and I've been beating this drum for a while, but I'll believe it when I see it, just because I don't know if there's quite the same sort of assembly line that there was when Dallas Turner and Chris Braswell came in to replace Will Anderson.
No, I think you hit on a really good point about this. The Alabama's pass rush, there's a lot of unknown there, right? Whether it's this bandit defensive end or if it's that Wolf outside linebacker, right? I think, and if you want to break them up further, you did a really good job touching on this. Bandit, we kind of know who the main dudes are. It's just a matter of who steps up and kind of owns that position. Whereas like Wolf, I don't know that we really know anything. Like, we know the names, and that's probably it. And I think part of that, that why don't we know maybe a little bit more about these guys? Well, last year, Alabama didn't really run everybody off the field in the way that they have normally. And so when you're in a lot of these close games later in the season, not just later in the season, throughout the season, those younger guys don't get those valuable late game reps that they would have against a Chattanooga or a Kentucky, right? Like they were in that South Florida game start to finish all the way to the end. Like, Dallas Turner could not come out of that game out of fear of one bust happening, right? Same thing with Tennessee. Same thing, Auburn went down to the wire. Ole Miss more or less went down to the wire, like, right? So there was just so many of those games where Alabama normally is up comfortably going into the fourth quarter that you can sneak in some rotation and you can get some of these younger guys key reps. They didn't get any of that last year, which is part of what more so maybe I think the Wolf than the Bandit, but really both of them in tandem. We don't know. We have no idea. And I'm curious, you two have been covering this program obviously longer than me. Alex, I'll throw it to you. When's the last time there was this much unknown about Alabama's pass rush coming into a season?
That's a really good question. It's been several years. Obviously, we're talking about pre-Will Anderson, but I think you're hitting on the point that applies to a lot of positions in terms of not blowing people out. I mean, that's the reason I think Georgia's where they're at right now as a program year over year, is because they can play those young guys a whole ton of snaps, and Alabama just hasn't had that killer instinct in some games. But there's also been a logjam at the top in terms of the edge rusher position. So if you want to be really optimistic, and I don't know how optimistic I really am about edge rusher, you can look at it and say, well, they haven't had the opportunity, so we don't know. There could be somebody really good there. We just haven't seen them. I think they would have found a way to get on the field and impact it. I will say that internally, when you talk about spring practice, really up until the last week and a half, they were feeling really good about their edge rushers because the offensive line was looking really bad, and it flipped. And that's why you heard Kalen DeBoer talk about, even before they made any move on the offensive line, he was feeling that was the place that made the biggest improvement. So it's like, what happened there? Did the offensive line get better? Did the pass rush get worse? It's probably somewhere in the middle, right? So yeah, I think in a way, the edge rusher, and I'm talking about the bandit end too, it concerns me almost more than the cornerback position does, because you've got to start there. You can have the best cornerbacks in the world and you leave them guarding for 6, 7, 8 seconds and they're screwed. So that unknown there. I'm not saying there's not talent there. I'm not saying somebody can't step up, but there's a whole lot of unknown when it comes to getting to the quarterback this year.
And you're trying to manufacture a pass rush by blitzing. And if you start blitzing Deontay Lawson and Jihad Campbell, or you start blitzing Devontae Smith out of the slot, like, you're only putting more pressure on those corners to hold their ground. So,
and there's no game wrecker inside. There appears to be no game wrecker on the interior.
No,
which can free up those guys on the outside, and that's why you got a domino effect there. You got a lot of solid tackles, but I don't think there's a guy who's really going to capture the attention of the opposing offensive line and really free up those areas. So I think Mike's right. I think they're going to have to manufacture it. Blitzing Devontae Smith, Malachi Moore, who's really good at doing that. It's scary to blitz the inside linebackers, but if you're not getting that pressure, you're going to have to figure out a way to get it done.
Yeah, and I think that, to me, describes the front seven in general as just solid. Like, I don't know if it's not a criticism. It's not heaping praise on them either. It's just, I don't know. Like, it's there. Like, they're good. I think they're reliable players. There are a lot of veterans in that front seven. It was just interesting to me when Nick Saban was talking about the defense, and he really pointed towards the corners, and I think it's rightfully so. But there might even be more talent at corner than there is just kind of in the front seven.
I think there is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just younger, inexperienced talent. I think the front seven's issue is kind of flipped. It's experience, but not necessarily the top level game-changing sort of talent you like to see.
One guy who I do think is going to be a dude with time, I think Noah Carter is going to be really good. I just don't know if it happens this year, but I think he could be a long-term option there, whether we're talking about late in the year or next season. But I think Mike's absolutely right. The back end of the defense has got plenty of talent. It's just all new.
Yeah, I mean, going forward too. I mean, their recruiting class, like Justin Hill coming in on the edge, I think they're going to find some of those guys. Maybe the defensive line might need some help with recruiting if you've listened to or read our message board a little bit. But it's true. Like, the defensive line, I think long term is probably going to need some guys. But I think the edge position, they've found some guys in kind of the long term.
Well, and the other thing I guess I'm curious to learn as fall camp unfolds too is I think it's easy to kind of look at that Wolf position and be like, yeah, that's where Dallas Turner would have fit in. Dallas Turner was asked to do, he was a sensational pass rusher. He was also asked every now and again to do a lot. Like, he was comfortable dropping back into coverage. He was okay with, maybe faking a rush and kind of sitting there on the edge just to set the edge. He was brilliant at setting the edge, period. And so I'm curious, like, is that all that's going to be asked of this Wolf position, or does, the new coaching staff, like, what does Kane Womack want out of this Wolf position? And once that's kind of identified, who in the room can do that the best? And to your guys' point too, this may not be something we know at the end of fall camp. This may not be something we find out until that game against Wisconsin, or even until maybe the Georgia game or somewhere thereafter, right? Because, those first 3 games, I know that after that bye week, they're going to really kind of take stock, what worked, what didn't. Let's get ready for this Georgia matchup. So I'm just very curious to see, if any of the guys in the room can fit what Womack wants at that position, and just who can do it the best, right? Because Quay Rousseau and Rianze Pierre are both super talented prospects as well, who, again, not a lot of playing time last year, not a lot of snaps in general. Could they thrive in this role? Is it different than what they signed up for when they initially committed and joined the program? I don't know. That's something that I'm kind of looking to get answered, over the next month.
Yeah, the Wisconsin game is going to be interesting, but the Georgia game is going to be the ultimate test in that, because of the balance that Georgia's offense brings to the table, as good as their offensive line is. Oh, by the way, yeah, you lose Brock Bowers, but Oscar Delp is going to be a freaking stud at tight end, so you're going to have to cover him in space too. So those guys, when you talk about the potential overload in terms of what you have to do in those positions, that's going to be the make or break test for some of these guys. And they might have to lean a little bit more veteran in that game.
Well, Kane Womack's going to be the least popular person in Alabama if he's dropping Quay Rousseau or Quandarius Robinson in the coverage on Oscar Delp. Fans do not like that. I'm just going to tell Kane Womack right now, do not drop an edge player into coverage, because there's nothing more that Alabama fans hate than that.
Well, good luck putting Devontae Smith on a 6'5" tight end too.
Right.
Like, the way the tight end position is evolved is just, it screws coordinators. They've got nobody to put, unless you've got a Jabril Peppers person out there, unless you've got a Kyle Hamilton who can just guard anybody. I mean, you're SOL.
They need a Brian Branch or Minka Fitzpatrick.
Yeah.
as you guys have been talking, I just did a Twitter search for Golding drop coverage, and man,
Would you like to read some for the
like
crowd,
meme
Mike?
tweets. Seeing Pete Golding drop 2 defensive ends in the coverage makes me so glad he's gone. Good God. Somebody else responded with Pete Golding logic. Let's drop Dallas Turner into coverage. Somebody else, me watching Pete Golding drop Will Anderson into coverage for the 8th time, and it's a meme of Joe Biden. Welcome to Alabama fans' feelings watching Pete Golding drop Will Anderson into coverage on 3rd downs.
Pete Golding was like a cockroach. He just could not go away. Every offseason, it was like, is this the year? Is this the year? Nope, it's not the year.
Will Anderson isn't leaving for the NFL because of the money. He's doing it so Pete Golding can't force him to drop into coverage anymore. 469 likes on that tweet.
Oh, Jesus.
See, Cody, you missed some of this. This was
if the Iron Bowl showed fans anything, it can get worse in terms of being a defensive coordinator. You could rush 2.
Right. And here's the thing. That was Nick Saban's defense. He was the one, and Nick Saban was fully in support of doing that with the outside linebackers. It's just fans could not wrap their heads around why that was happening, and it was hilarious to watch for a long time.
The position group I'm excited to watch, follow, monitor, cover, whatever through fall camp is the cornerback position. And we touched on this a little bit when we were talking about the pass rush, just how a lot of turnover here, right? Kool-Aid McKinstry and Terrion Arnold, now both in the NFL. Trey Amos, who I was very, very high on. He was primed to be, cornerback 1. He has since transferred to Ole Miss to play for none other than Pete Golding. In their place comes a handful of transfers and a handful of very, very talented freshmen, right? I think if we're looking at the depth chart right now, Damani Jackson, probably that CB1 role, based mostly on the experience that he's bringing. You've also got Deshaun Jones, who came in from Wake Forest. And then you've got 3 5-star freshmen, Zabian Brown, who really impressed during spring ball, Zay Mincy, as well as Jalen Mbakwe. Also got Jaleel Hurley in that room if you're looking to fill it out 3 deep. Look, I'm just very intrigued to see how this kind of shakes out when the Damani Jackson acquisition, I suppose, happened when he officially committed to transfer from USC to Alabama. I was not particularly high on that addition. That was before we all learned that Nick Saban was going to retire and the entire secondary was going to turn over, basically. But his transfer at the time, right, the way you frame it is like, okay, he's betting on learning from a better coaching staff to hopefully get the best out of his 5-star abilities, right? Because he was a 5-star prospect, immensely talented athlete. Can the right coaching get the most out of him? Now that coaching, it's a different coaching, right? They brought in Mo Linguist and Colin Hitchler to basically coach the secondary in tandem. Kane Womack's running the defense now, not Nick Saban. Can the different coaching staff get more out of him? They've also brought in Deshaun Jones to kind of help shore up the cornerback room specifically. I think they got a few other guys in the secondary room, I suppose, who can play in coverage, but they're mostly safeties. And then you've got the 3 freshmen. And I know Zabian Brown was kind of the dude that stood out through spring ball, but Zay Mincy and Jalen Mbakwe are 2 immensely talented guys. What is this secondary going to look like? What are the corners specifically going to look like? Because I'm pretty convinced that whoever gets trotted out to start week 1 may not be the guys that come out and start week 5 against Georgia, or perhaps, week 6, 7, 8, as you go down the season. And so I'm just very curious to kind of see how it evolves. Can the freshmen take some big steps forward in fall camp? Are they going to lean on the veterans a little bit, so much as they are, Damani Jackson, Deshaun Jones, and then kind of let the freshmen come along at their own pace? Are we going to get a baptism by fire? I'm not 100% sure. What makes this also super interesting to me is that the first 3 games, and I know I've said this before, first 3 games of the season are against 3 teams who will throw the ball around the yard a little bit, right? You got Western Kentucky week 1. You've got South Florida with Byron Brown. I know they don't really chuck the ball as much as maybe a Western Kentucky or, a Luke Fickell Wisconsin offense. But Byron Brown's a really talented quarterback. It's going to be a test for the secondary and especially the cornerbacks. And then mentioned Wisconsin on the road. That in itself is going to be a tough game for many different reasons, but they've got Tyler Van Dyke running Luke Fickell's offense now. I find that to be very, very interesting, like a very intriguing styles make fights matchup between the Wisconsin offense and Alabama's cornerbacks specifically. We've talked about this position group at length. I'm curious what you guys think going into fall camp. Mike, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to a Kalen DeBoer interview during media days. I forget where it was, so sorry if I'm not giving the appropriate party credit. But the first names out of his mouth were Damani Jackson, Xavier Brown, and Jalen Mbakwe. I don't know if there's any meaning to that. I think sometimes, you don't want to read too much into it, but sometimes it is a little bit telling, like where his mind goes when he starts talking about a position. I don't know if that's a bad thing for Zay Mincy or Deshaun Jones, especially Jones, because he hasn't really, he's been out there in summer workouts, and theoretically coaches can't participate or see any of that stuff, but obviously they certainly know what's going on. So I think Jones is the big linchpin there. It's just a matter of, he played a lot at Wake Forest. How does that translate to playing in the SEC? How does that translate to playing in this defense with a different coaching staff? I don't think they know that. I don't think we know that. I don't think he knows that. I think it's just something that's going to have to play out over the next 3 weeks. I think these first couple weeks of camp, there's probably going to be a lot of rotation among that, those first 2 teams at corner outside of Damani. I think Damani's probably locked in with the first team, and then your number 2 corner with the first team, and then your 2 corners with the second team. There's probably going to be 4 players. If you want to give Hurley a shot, 5 players, that really rotate in that group, and you just kind of see where you're at by, the second scrimmage, third scrimmage, or third week of camp. So I don't know if there is an answer to that yet. I think it's just see where guys are at. But again, I want to completely discount the work that Xavier Brown did in the spring to get in the position where he started the spring game. And he seems to be, the most ready to play of those 3 freshman corners. I think playing at, modern day probably helps. And, has a relationship with Damani. I don't know if that means anything in terms of communication or whatever, but, those 2 guys played high school together. I think even Xavier replaced Damani Jackson when he got hurt. So does that help? I don't know, but that's kind of where I'm at in that position right now.
There's a couple places my mind goes with this, which is by week 3 of camp, if things aren't going great, do they start looking at cross-training guys who are playing other positions? I'm thinking about a Red Morgan at that Husky position. I'm thinking about a King Mack and a Cam Howard at safety, guys who aren't necessarily going to start at that position. So maybe you say, hey, there are break in case of emergency cornerback. You hope you don't get into that type of situation. But the other part is stylistically being different as a defense, right? And not playing that pattern matching, more mentally exhaustive style of coverage, and playing something that seems a little bit simpler, see ball, get ball, where you are, we call it a vision defense. So does that help those young guys, those 5-star freshmen, speed up the learning curve? I think there's going to be a learning curve. There are going to be growing pains. But how quickly can they kind of narrow that gap? And does this form of defense help them at all in that respect? I'm very curious to see how that works. Because for them to be successful, I think it's going to be the secondary is going to have to evolve throughout the course of the season. It's going to be a lot of learning on the job.
Well, and the other thing, too, that I think was interesting was, after spring, cornerback and really secondary in total was a position group that I believe it was DeBoer who was like, we need a little bit more experience. We just don't have enough experience. Well, they went and got that with guys like Deshaun Jones and Cam Howard and King Mack. So, but when you think about the way he phrased it, it is, are you going to get experience because the freshmen aren't ready, or are you going to get experience to help bring the freshmen along, right? And so I don't know what that looks like from the cornerback position. I tend to agree that Damani's probably starting in some capacity. But then, this is another question I had, and I'm curious what you guys think too. Alex, I'll throw it back to you. When do we see, whether it's Xavier Brown, Zay Mincy, Jalen Mbakwe, when do we see those freshmen start and play significant snaps? Is it earlier, or is it after they maybe navigate the first few weeks of the season?
I think it's after they navigate the first few weeks of the season. I think at the end of the day, you don't get a Deshaun Jones to sit the bench. He's got too much experience. I don't think he leaves Wake Forest for a reserve type of role. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to be Damani and Deshaun. Those are my picks to start the season. But I definitely could see that situation evolving. And I just warn, there's always you have to read between the lines with coaches, but especially what they say about their roster in the spring going into a transfer portal season. You want to toe that line of saying it's a lot easier to say we need depth and experience as opposed to saying I need a starter, because then those freshmen see that and say, well, what the hell am I doing here? So I think at the end of the day, you have to trust what you see, and what I see is they went and got somebody with starting experience from a power 4 program, and you don't do that if you don't think that guy can start.
I think that's fair. Those were the position groups that we are interested in following, monitoring, covering when fall camp opens on Wednesday. Now we're going to circle it back around and discuss some of the players that we're excited to watch. We've already touched on a handful of guys, but we got 3 other guys that I think we're all interested in seeing during fall camp. Alex, I'll throw it back to you to start. What player are you most excited to cover when fall camp opens?
Not to be captain obvious, but it's Jalen Milroe. It's how this guy who finished 6th in the Heisman Trophy, despite some pretty obvious shortcomings in his game, how he evolves within a new coaching staff, within a new personnel, within not entering a season as fighting for a starting job. You know who you are for the first time, and you're with a coaching staff where it's the head coach and the coordinator. Everybody, they play offense. They're all on the same page. All these things should be working in Jalen Milroe's favor. And like we talked about on last week's pod, I think him going to New York and doing the press row is pretty much playing the flag that says, hey, I should be the face of college football. It's not as much him saying this as ESPN and CBS saying it, but we're all waiting on that next step. And I think he's ready to take it, but until it happens, we're going to have to watch it pretty closely, because there are those things where we can see him going backwards if he can't make those reads and those progressions, if he doesn't fit in a new offense, if he can't adapt, if the offensive line isn't good right away. All of those things are going to be worth watching. So while, it's super obvious, Alabama doesn't make the playoff if Jalen Milroe isn't a star quarterback. I don't think there's any route there. So they need him to be really good, and let's see if he can take that next step and be one of the best players in college football.
When you say take the next step, what specifically are you looking for out of Jalen Milroe this season for him to, I guess, jump into that next tier of quarterback?
Doing the meat and potatoes stuff. I know he can throw the ball deep. I know he can make something out of nothing. I've seen all that. Can you make the third read? Can you make the check down? Can you throw it away? Can you escape the pocket when there's pressure? Because there's been moments where he doesn't feel it very well, or he speeds up the clock when it doesn't need to be sped up. It's a lot of things you associate with an inexperienced quarterback that he's just got to figure out. And just doing, getting 5 yards on first down, so you're putting yourself in a good situation. It's not terribly complicated stuff. He's just got to do it consistently. And then once you do that, everything else is gravy. You just need to get them march people down the field instead of going 50 yards pop all the time. It's just not a sustainable form of offense, I don't think. So if he can do that, he goes into a star quarterback, and he goes into a conversation of, can he be an NFL starting quarterback? Because the traits are there. It's just the consistency and the decision-making piece that he's really got to figure out on a consistent basis.
Mike, I know you've been outspoken about the importance of Jalen Milroe and his continued development for, Alabama this upcoming season. I'm kind of curious what you think. I'm under the impression that the brain trust at Alabama now, and Alex alluded to this, you got an offensive head coach, offensive coordinator, they're both on the same page. How much is that, do you think, going to help Jalen Milroe this year? How much is that going to elevate him, that he has a brain trust that we believe maybe won't let him down in ways that maybe Tommy Rees did last season?
If I'm being completely honest, sometimes I think that part of it is overrated, because I think people just love to just dump on offensive coordinators here.
I guess I'm not saying that it was solely Tommy Rees, right, but I feel like they could have given Milroe maybe a better foundation with which to work, and they maybe didn't do that until later in the season, when they should have maybe done it earlier in the season. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, it's just, again, this is a more of a broad statement, but like, people just love to dump on coordinators here, and it's not always justified. Like, I just talked about Pete Golding. I don't think that was justified. I think, yes, there was some criticisms that made sense with Pete Golding, but it was Nick Saban's defense.
Yeah.
And like, Nick Saban is a defensive coach. So like, where does the buck stop with him? And they were still a top 10 defense and number 2 in the SEC pretty much every year with Pete Golding. They just weren't number 1 in giving up 7 points a game like they were 10 years earlier. Similarly, with the offense, it was Nick Saban's offense. It's his playbook. Bill O'Brien had to come in and learn Nick Saban's playbook. Tommy Rees had to come in and learn Nick Saban's playbook. No, they're not Steve Sarkisian. They're not Lane Kiffin. They're not the cream of the crop, creative minds and play callers. They still had one of the best offenses in college football with Bill O'Brien. They did not have one of the best offenses in college football with Tommy Rees, but I mean, Jalen Milroe got a lot better with Tommy Rees than he was with Bill O'Brien. You could also say, like, there's 3 different coordinators now. Like, if it doesn't work with Kalen DeBoer and Nick Sheridan, then does the problem lie with Jalen Milroe, or does it lie with the 3 different coordinators that you've tried with him? I'm not saying it didn't work last year, but hypothetically, if the season does not go well, I think you can lay some more blame at the feet of the player and not just the coach. So yes, coaching gets you so far, but the player still has to be the player. Like, I think the coaching aspect of it gets overrated. Maybe just it's Alabama thing, it's a coordinator thing, but that's kind of where I fall on that. I do think having Kalen DeBoer being an offensive-minded head coach, having developed quarterbacks before helps. I do think there's questions about Nick Sheridan just in terms of his experience as an offensive coordinator. It's thin. We're not talking about huge results at Indiana, better players here, but I don't know. I just have to wait and see. Like, this is still a whole new world. So to answer that question, that's kind of where I'm at on that. But I did want to say something on Alex that I think makes sense, is that if Jalen Milroe doesn't take the next step, then they're not going to make the playoffs. It's probably true. Just because when would they pull the plug if it wasn't working with Jalen Milroe? That's the big question. If you lose 2 games, or sorry, let's start with this. If you lose 1 game and Jalen Milroe has a bad game, and that's part of the reason why you lost, do you just immediately bench Jalen Milroe the next week? I think the answer is no. Let's say you lose a second game, just hypothetically, let's say it's Wisconsin and Georgia. Then do you start thinking about starting Ty Simpson against Vanderbilt? And at that point, you've already had 2 losses in September, and your chances of making the playoff are thin. Like, you can make the playoff with 2 losses, but you need Ty Simpson to run the table the rest of the year. So I do think, yes, they probably go down with the ship if Jalen Milroe's not working, if he's not what they need to be out of a quarterback, then you might have to take 2 or 3 losses with him before you make a switch. But in theory, you have a talented quarterback behind him who's now has a few years of experience under his belt. So I think the hypothetical of if it does not work out, and I'm not saying it won't, I'm just saying if it doesn't, when would they pull the plug? I think is a really interesting question, and just how deep would it go before they would make a switch?
It would have to be a disaster because they haven't laid any groundwork for there to be a question about quarterback. You kind of have to do that, right? And that's, as somebody's been around long enough to remember the Jalen Hurts Tua thing. That was part of the conversation, was like, is this young guy who we're hearing all this buzz about, is he going to be there at the end? And it did. They ultimately had to make the switch late. So I think you have to lay the groundwork if you think I need to pull the trigger fast. Instead, they're doing everything they can to make it clear that this is Jalen Milroe is the quarterback, and this is Jalen Milroe's team. He is the leader of this football team. He's got all those leadership traits. So it'd have to be Alabama's in a bad place, in a place where I don't think they can recover from, for them to make that decision because of the impact it would have on the locker room as well. To go back to our coordinators overrated thing.
Nah.
Yes, they are. But also, I think the whole idea that they were running Nick Saban's offense, I think that was more true with the defense. I think they were running Nick Saban's terminology. It was the same pantry of ingredients. You just had guys who didn't know which ingredients to pick out, or they go the same damn ingredient every single time. Like, you can only put balsamic glaze on so many dishes, Tommy Rees, before you have screwed up the look of this dinner. It's terrible.
Why not let them run their own terminology? Bill O'Brien had a whole 2 decades of experience as a college and
I would argue Bill O'Brien was trying to do too much. Tommy Rees was trying to do too little. I think Tommy Rees, there was reason to believe because of his youth that he would come in under Nick Saban and blossom. The problem when you looked at Tommy Rees's resume was it was his best early at Notre Dame, and it kept tapering off. And in Notre Dame, you're playing with better talent than everybody you're facing by virtue of the way they schedule. They schedule really well top to bottom, but they, outside of a game against, Georgia here and there, they're not really playing an SEC schedule. So it was a little bit underwhelming when you step back to look at it. So that situation failing didn't necessarily surprise me. Then you go back and you look at Sark and you look at Lane and you realize this is what it can be if you are creative, if you do think outside the box. And Kalen DeBoer has shown ability to do that. So having the backstop on Sheridan, I agree there's questions about Sheridan by virtue of his youth and what happened at Indiana at the end. But having that backstop of Kalen DeBoer, I think they're going to be significantly better schematically. And maybe more important than all of that is they should be better in personnel. They should be a better offensive line. They should be a better receiver room than the last 2 years. So what does all that mean? It's on Jalen Milroe to be good, because if they're not, it's going to all land at his feet.
10 out of 10, no notes. I got no argument there. The only thing that I do find interesting about the whole coordinator thing is that Milroe, this is his 4th year in the program. He'll have been through 3 different coordinators. Obviously, I'm a diehard NFL fan, and I pay attention to conversations that go on in NFL circles and whatnot. Quarterbacks tend to get the benefit of the doubt when early in their career they get cycled through various coaches, right? Like, look at a guy like Trevor Lawrence as an example. So I would like to think that applies to a guy like Milroe and really all college quarterbacks when they're still very much in developmental mode, that having that many different types of coaches and offensive coordinators and play callers and playbooks to learn, I'm not saying it stunted growth, because we saw a lot out of Milroe last year, but I think continuity and everybody being on the same page, and also just having that type of offensive minded brain trust, I think is going to do wonders for him, even if it is, another coach, another playbook, different schemes and stuff that he's got to learn. I don't know. If it applies to one, I feel like in a sense it could apply to others. You get to the point in those NFL conversations where, yes, at some point it is the quarterback, because it just doesn't work with any of them. Milroe showed last year that he can do this. Like, he is a good college quarterback, and I think he can go from good to great because of the offensive brain trust. That maybe shows where my mind's at regarding this particular topic of conversation coming into fall camp. I believe a lot of good things are going to happen with Alabama's offense this year because of all the pieces that are there. But I also do agree with Alex's, overriding point that it does come down to Milroe playing well.
Yeah, we just got to see it. Last year was a developmental year. It's because he's been in the program 3 years at that point doesn't mean he was still not developing. This is the year where you're the guy, and there's no more question about that. So you got to take the step forward. And I think he would say the exact same thing. I don't think I'm putting any more pressure on him than he would put on himself. This is kind of the prove it year for him.
Yeah, this is his last year at Alabama.
Yeah.
Either way, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Mike, what player are you excited, intrigued by, curious by when fall camp opens Wednesday?
Well, if Alex was Captain Obvious, I'm going to be General Obvious and say Ryan Williams, because it's probably even a bigger pick in terms of a guy that we haven't seen yet, because he wasn't at spring camp. He was a summer enrollee, has worked behind the scenes. These player run practices over the summer. The first time we're going to see him in an Alabama uniform on the field is going to be Wednesday morning. So obviously that's number one, I think, for a lot of people in terms of what they're looking at. But from a bigger picture standpoint, it's how quickly can he ascend the ladder? How quickly can he look like he belongs and get that chemistry with Jalen Milroe? And how many reps does he get with Jalen Milroe is another part of it too, because I think, Jamarcus Shepard did that interview over the summer on the radio. He mentioned he was, basically running with the 4th and 5th team. So if you do that, you're catching passes from Austin Mack and Dylan Lonergan. So how many reps does he get with Jalen Milroe? Now, granted, that's in team drills. In some of the positional drills, you're just kind of cycling through quarterbacks. But in actual live reps, how do they balance not pushing him up the ladder too quickly with having him get that experience with Jalen Milroe? Because, look, there's hype around Ryan Williams. There's no doubt about it. Marcus Shepard talked about it. I think Kalen DeBoer has been measured with his comments, but I think he's also, expressed some excitement about what he can do. And, just there's a lot of expectation he's going to be there, and maybe as soon as day one is going to make an impact. So the clock's ticking on that. We're talking about 30 days, 32 days away from the season opener. How quickly can Ryan Williams become that sort of player that can get those first or maybe second team reps and consistently be the player that a lot of people think he can be? Next Julio Jones, all the things that have been thrown out about him, I think there's a lot of talent there, a very high ceiling. If it doesn't come together that quickly, then the Jeremy Bernard, Kendrick Law, Kobe Prentice combination seems like the most likely on top of that depth chart. Emmanuel Henderson maybe is up there, number 4 as well. And that's a good group. Again, I think there's just a little bit of a cap on that in terms of how much it would excite me. We can debate Isaiah Bond last year. I think Jermaine Burton became a more consistent player for them last year. And obviously a player that NFL teams liked, going in the 3rd round. So let's not discount where they were last year at wide receiver, but where they were last year at wide receiver wasn't great either. So I don't know if they're better at wide receiver as it stands right now than they were last year. I think if Ryan Williams becomes a star, then they will be. And if they're not better than where they were last year was a question mark, then where are they? That's kind of the logic in my mind. So I think Ryan Williams is a big piece of how far that group goes. Obviously, having a different coaching staff, a different scheme, a different coordinator, a different position coach is all potentially going to help. But if you're asking me, it's 3rd and 9 and you're losing by a touchdown to Georgia in the 4th quarter, who's going to get open? And can that Jalen Milroe to Kendrick Law connection win you a game that you need to win? I don't know. Like, I thought Tua to Jerry Jeudy could do it, and they weren't losing too many games. They were up by 50. I thought Devontae Smith and Mac Jones could do that. I thought even Bryce Young and Jamison Williams were capable of doing that. I don't know if Jalen Milroe and Jeremy Bernard or Jalen Milroe and Kendrick Law, or even last year, Jalen Milroe and Jermaine Burton were truly capable of doing those sorts of things, or at least players that I would feel totally comfortable about in those situations. So it's a broken record, but kind of see it when I believe it.
I think it's fair to wonder about the talent level at receiver potentially not being better than next year if things don't work out, than last year if things don't work out. I think the production, though, will be better almost no matter what. I think they just did not maximize what they had at receiver, which I don't think was terribly a lot to begin with. But the consistency, it just wasn't there with any of them. Like, even Burton, who was probably the most consistent, there were games where you just didn't hear his name called. Kendrick Law, Kobe Prentice, those guys, they flashed and they were gone. It was just all the time. So I think
Jalen Hale too.
Yeah,
I mean, this game.
Yeah, you've got to figure out who your guys are and just ride that horse. So I think Jeremy Bernard we feel confident in him. I think Ryan Williams again is that guy who you just wonder, he's the swing guy. Is it going to be really good or is it not going to be really good? I think it depends on him because he can really let those other pieces fall into place. It's just been, I don't know about you guys, it's been really strange. I won't say the hype train is out of control with Ryan Williams, but we're so used to, if Nick Saban was the head coach and we asked Malachi Moore, Tyler Booker, and Jalen Milroe about Ryan Williams at SEC Media Days, they would have said practically nothing.
All the freshmen look good out there. All the young guys are working hard.
Exactly.
To get better.
You would have heard a version of that. And it was not that. And I don't think that's wrong, but it was very much like, oh, this guy can play. And it's like, so, okay, let's see it. I do think there will be an element of let's spoon feed this guy early and not overwhelm him. I do think you don't want to break him early if you know what the potential is there long term. But I think when push comes to shove, that middle point of the season, if Kendrick Law and Kobe Prentice and Emmanuel Henderson aren't getting open, there's your emergency. Go throw Ryan Williams out there and let him learn on the fly. It's just tough when you think about this guy should still be in high school. Like, he's still reclassified. Like, God bless South Alabama high school kids for not having to deal with him for another year, because that would have been another massacre. But the physical and mental maturity piece of it, we'll have to wait and see what that looks like for Ryan.
Yeah, when you're talking about October, you're going head to head. I know it's not head to head on the field, but Luther Burden on one side, and who's Alabama's guy that they're trying to go to? Tennessee. You have Brew McCoy. Like who's Alabama's guy? At that point, is it Jeremy Bernard still? Is it Kendrick Law? Is it Ryan Williams? Like that was a problem for this team the last couple of years. Just to trade scores and trade big plays with another team that has that sort of weapon. That's a question.
Yeah. If he's the fourth receiver, I just wonder how successful the offense is.
And I think I'm most curious about how they're going to use him. Like, because he's, again, 6'1", 165 pounds, not very big. There have been other receivers of that mold that have come through and have done fairly well. I'm not saying he's the next Devonta Smith, but that is just one example of a smaller receiver going out and dominating. But I'm just like really curious how they're going to use him, because you've got, Jeremy Bernard's probably right now your de facto X receiver, right? Like he's the guy that's going to be on the outside. Kobe Prentice is probably going to be in the slot. I think Jalen Hale was also another outside guy. And if he was healthy, that would have allowed them to maybe do some other stuff with Jeremy Bernard. I can see Williams fitting into almost any of those roles. Like I can see him being the slot guy and just getting open real quick and, just a quick little 6-yard slant or whatever the case is. I could see him being put on the outside and just, hey, bro, use your speed and just go, right? I could see him being kind of, what Isaiah Bond was last year, where he's just kind of coming over underneath to, once everybody else kind of clears out some space. I don't know how they're going to use him. I'm excited to learn that because of, DeBoer and Nick Sheridan and Jamarcus Shepard. Like, they clearly have a really good track record when it comes to the offensive side of the ball. And then with Shepard, there's specifically the development of receivers. Like he can not only make good to great, he can make great elite, right? We saw that at Washington last year. So we know he's excited about this guy. We know just, and I think a lot of the excitement also stems from the fact that the head coach is an offensive guy now. So like maybe he just can't help himself. I don't know. I'm just very curious to see how they're going to use him. And I agree, like, probably going to spoon feed him and slowly bring him along. I think one of the comparisons we made, Alex, not too long ago was Luther Burden, where his first year at Mizzou, he wasn't thrown to the wolves right away. They kind of slowly brought him along. And then the second half of the season, boom, he popped. I could see Ryan Williams taking a very similar route this first year. Or maybe they just slowly bring him along the entire way through and he doesn't pop. And, the pop comes next year. I'm not 100% sure. And that's another intriguing part about this going into fall camp. How are they going to use them? What does it look like? How does it impact everybody else? Not just within the receiver room, but, when it comes to the offense in general. I'm very curious to see that.
And what's exciting is let's play it out. If he's your fourth receiver with Jeremy Bernard, Kobe Prentice, and Kendrick Law, those are all dudes that if you get them the ball in space, they can go. Like they're all yards after catch guys. So how they mix and match those pieces was going to be really interesting. But I'll say this: I feel like I'm going to say I'm old enough to remember when we were hyping up Caleb Odom. That was only like 2 months ago. I still think a 6'5" receiver who can run like that. I don't care that he's a true freshman. I think you find a way to get that dude on the football field too. So as much as like we rightfully want to get excited about Ryan Williams, I'm very excited to watch him. I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that they've got another guy and true freshman who could be an absolute weapon if he can come along. And he was there in the spring, so he's got a little bit of a leg up in that respect.
I think we're going to see a lot of CJ Dupree, Robbie Oots, and Cole Adams on the field.
There's your cheetah package on offense. What do you call that? Is that the rhino package? We got to come up with another.
Run the ball on first down, run the ball on second down, throw a 5-yard slant to Cole Adams on 3rd and 3. That's your.
Did they hire Kirk Ferentz to run the offense during the offseason? How that work?
Dang. Iowa catching strays on an Alabama sports podcast. That is welcome to college football season, ladies and gentlemen. The one player I'm very intrigued by, there's a lot of players clearly that we're all intrigued by, but I'll end the show with this. Jaheim Otis. I'm very curious in the same vein that I asked about Caden Proctor, like where is he mentally, physically, emotionally? Same thing with Jaheim Otis. This was a dude that obviously played as a true freshman. He played fairly well. He was dealing with various injuries last year, so I don't know that he was truly able to pop in the way that we thought he might. I think so long as he's healthy, this could be a very big year for him. This is a guy that I know a lot of NFL guys like. When you look at the state of Alabama's defensive line, he is part of the reason why we think it's a good group with great potential. And I think his overall skill and talent and ability is why that potential could be great. This is a unit that's looking for a game wrecker. I'm of the belief that he is a potential candidate for one of those game-altering forces that could pop, especially on the interior. But as we saw earlier in the season last year, they moved him around quite a bit. They put him on the outside. They put him back inside. This is a dude that you can kind of move him around in different spots. And so health is the big thing. Where's he at? Because I don't know that he participated at all in spring ball because he was he was recovering from his, I think it was a surgery to fix his knee, right? So where's he at there? And 2, can he jump in, immediately be one of those starters on the defensive line and not just be a starter, but like, can he truly be one of those impact players that this unit really, really needs? I'm curious to see if he can be that dude this year, because I think he's one of those candidates. And we've seen that when he's healthy, very, very good football player, very, very disruptive on that defensive interior, and so much disruptive that he's a dude that could command double teams to open up those one-on-one matchups for the guys at Bandit, for the guys at that Wolf position. If he's healthy, this defensive line group has the potential to, I think, be very good, possibly even great. But a lot of it kind of hinges on his health and his ability and kind of where he's at after dealing with injuries last season.
It's been a long time since they've had that. I mean, maybe since Quinnen Williams, since they've had that interior game wrecker on the inside, and not a guy who necessarily is going to fill up the sheet with sacks, but is going to pressure the quarterback, is going to make the running back step 2 feet to the side instead of running through the A gap. They need that guy. And I do think I'm not as high on them as you are, Cody, but I do think that Jaheim is probably the guy with the highest upside with a likely chance of playing this year, that being the caveat. So if he can be healthy and he can turn into that, it solves a lot of problems. So it could be, I don't know how optimistic I am, but he could be a guy who could fix some issues on a number of levels in this defense if he can turn into that.
Yeah, and he may not be this game-altering, I'm going to take over type force, but he could be a dude that could demand double teams, right? And when you've got him and Tim Keenan, who are both on the field at the same time, both demanding that type of attention from the offense and the offensive line, that's what'll open up Jamarian Latham. That's what could open up whoever emerges at that Wolf spot. That could really, if Womack wants to get frisky with it and decides to blitz Deontay Lawson, and he was very good when blitzing last season, you've got 4 guys dedicated to 2, that's going to open up a lane somewhere for Lawson or Campbell or somebody to get home, or if you want to blitz the Husky position. It just unlocks so much more and allows the defense to be a little bit more versatile if you've got that interior presence. And I think Otis is a candidate that can do it. I also think Tim Keenan's a dude that could potentially take another step forward. He was a fall camp revelation last year and turned into a very, very good interior presence for Alabama last year. If Otis is healthy, they got 2 of those dudes. And I think Otis has maybe a little bit of a higher ceiling in terms of being disruptive than a team Tim Keenan does. So his health, I think, could really unlock his health and ability. I think could unlock a lot for Alabama's defense as a whole, but especially that defensive interior.
Yeah, and it's been a long time coming with Jaheim Otis. I was just looking up. I mean, he's been, I don't say hyped, but he's been on the radar for a while. I mean, this is Barstool Sports, July 31st, 2017. So we're talking almost 7 years ago this week. Meet Jaheim Otis, the 6'4", 286-pound 8th grader who already has 3 SEC offers, including 1 from Alabama. So he got offered by Alabama in 2017. Alex would know better than me who the defensive line coach was back then. Was it
Bo Davis?
Was it Bo? Yeah, that was before was it Brian
Kuligowski?
Who was it?
This is great podcasting.
We're
One
going
guy
on.
is taking.
I don't remember it, but
I was covering the whole SEC. I don't remember all of Alabama.
You're talking like ancient history here. It was Carl Dunbar who offered him.
Whoa.
Dunbar has been at like 6 different teams.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a long time coming for Jaheim Otis. And then he got like over 400 pounds and had to lose all this weight. Like, I don't want to say this is a make or break year, but I agree with Cody that this is a big year for him. This is a player that, I think has a lot of potential, but last year was just underwhelming. Kind of had the knee injury, didn't play as much. Just didn't really seem right. So yeah, I mean, it's a big year. He's a big guy. And if he can live up to that hype and kind of that, Barstool publicity from 7 years ago, then could be a big player for him.
Barstool publicity. Oh my.
There's no corner of the internet Mike will not find you.
That's right.
No, I'm excited to see where he's at. Player that we're going to monitor through fall camp. That's all we've really got on today's show, guys. We finally get to, take some time over the next month to really dig into the nitty-gritty of the 2024 Alabama football team. We're going to be bringing you more podcasts, some other topics of conversation I want to make sure we get to before the season kicks off. But we're also, with fall camp kicking off on Wednesday, going to be bringing you pretty regular updates about the things that we're learning, the things that we're seeing, what Coach Kalen DeBoer and his staff are telling us, what the players are telling us as we navigate fall camp. It's going to be a really exciting time. Like Mike said, we're 32 days away from week 1, Alabama versus Western Kentucky. Going to be a lot jam-packed into the next 32 days with fall camp starting up, and it'll be game week before we know it. So that's all we've got today. We'll be back later this week with some of our earlier takeaways, as well as a discussion about who we believe can win the national championship this year. That's a fun topic I'm excited to explore with these guys. In the meantime, though, be sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 247 Sports. You can still get 30% off an annual VIP membership, a year's worth of Bama 247 and 247 Sports coverage for less than $10. You guys should absolutely cash in on that special. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening, and we will talk to you all again soon.